All right, welcome to Unit 1, Topic 2, PowerPoint 3 on gas exchange and transport. So we're looking at gas exchange, and in Pearson Biology 11, Section 5.2, we're on page 160 onwards. All right, there's a fair few learning goals from the Queensland syllabus for this PowerPoint. So by the end of the lesson, you need to be able to explain the relationship between the structure and function of different gas exchange surfaces, such as alveoli and gills, in terms of exchange of gases like oxygen and CO2. You need to be able to explain how the structure and function of capillaries facilitates the exchange of materials between the internal environment and the cells. And you need to use different data to predict the direction in which materials will be exchanged between alveoli and capillaries and muscle tissue. Let's have a look at some of the different gas exchange mechanisms across different species. We're going to look in particular at certain species, but over here on the right you can see that there's a great difference between different animals, and whether they, no matter what the animal is, there is going to be some form of gas exchange system. The reason for this is, as we've learnt in the past, we know that plants need CO2 for photosynthesis. We know that humans and animals need oxygen to do cellular respiration. So at a molecular level, we know about cellular respiration and photosynthesis and the gas requirements for those. So we need to look now at the bigger picture. How do we get those gases and get rid of the waste gases? For us, focusing on humans, we know that oxygen needs to be taken in readily to keep aerobic respiration going. We need to get rid of that CO2 as well, because if we start to build up CO2, that can have problems like increasing the acidity of the blood. Animals have different demands for their respiration purposes. So some animals have a higher energy demand than others, and different parts of the body that need more energy to do certain tasks. So each animal is well adapted to its environment as well as their needs, and there is a video that you guys can watch on the PowerPoint to just introduce you to some of those different mechanisms. Now, us as multicellular organisms rely on really complex systems to ensure that gases are able to enter and exit the body. Now, we can group those into open or closed circulatory systems. Now, for really simple organisms like flatworms and seaweed, they are going to do diffusion straight across their body surface. Now, remember, diffusion can happen across the cell membrane if the cell membrane is really thin and we're just passing simple substances like gases. So for flatworms and seaweeds, this works for them because they're flat and thin. So there's a very thin membrane for the gases to simply diffuse across. And things like flatworms and seaweed also have a large surface area, which allows them to get all of the gases that they need via simple diffusion, because their bodies are elongated and there's a lot of surface area. Now, in terms of an open circulatory system, this is going to be things like insects, spiders, and snails. There's no distinction between extracellular fluid and blood. There's no blood vessels, and rather than using a circulatory system, these organisms use muscle contractions as a way to pump blood around. Lastly, we've got closed circulatory systems where we have blood that's enclosed in vessels in a single or double circuit, like a respiratory system. So that includes fish as well as vertebrates. So humans have a closed circulatory system. So having a look at some of these different gas exchange surfaces, we talked about these small, simple organisms. Now, a worm isn't single-celled, but they are very simple, and gas exchange can occur directly from the environment into the animal. And that happens by simple diffusion. If we took a cut of this worm and had a look at the worm down its body like this, this is looking at a cross-section of the worm's body. Now you can see that there's this thin layer of cells that surround the outer circumference of the worm. And if we take a closer look, that is a singular layer of cells. So it's really thin, and we know from what we've learnt about cells that diffusion can occur across a membrane with small gases. Now, because it's so thin and flat, oxygen's able to diffuse straight across this single layer of cells and into the vasculature, which is just beneath that cell layer. If this was deeper down, like our vessels are in humans, simple diffusion couldn't happen like that. It's a very short space. In the same way, waste CO2 can leave the vasculature and be removed into the external environment. Now, for us as well-developed animals, we have specialized systems that are needed to do this because we're a lot more complex and there's a lot more to us. So we have both a respiratory system and a circulatory system. Now, we're going to take a closer look at the human respiratory system. But if we think about our lungs, at the very, very ends of our lungs, in the finest of the air sacs, we have a structure called alveoli. And that's where our gas exchange actually takes place. So regardless of whether we're a simple worm or we're a human with lungs, in order for gas exchange to be efficient, there are some key points that should be common among gas exchange surfaces. The first is that the surface area should be as large as possible. Now, as I said about the worm, because they're doing simple diffusion, they generally have an elongated, large surface area. In humans, when we take a look at the alveoli, they look like little cauliflowers. And there's so many of them, little bunches of air sacs, which are there like that to maximize surface area. Secondly, the barrier should be as thin as possible. So with this one here, we're talking about single cells. And like we'll see with the human alveoli in the lungs, they are also single-celled. So even though it's a longer process to get into there for humans traveling through a respiratory system, the surface itself is still a single-layered, single-cell layer. Third, there should be an adequate supply of gas. If we think about concentrations of things, if we don't have enough gas in the environment, then gas isn't going to diffuse into a worm. Likewise, we're not going to be able to breathe it in to our systems. So there needs to be, when our oxygen levels are low, that stimulates us to breathe oxygen in from the environment into our cells. And lastly, there needs to be efficient removal of the substance. So for us, we produce carbon dioxide, and the process is not going to continue to work unless we get rid of that CO2 and allow us to take up oxygen again. Okay, so we've talked about skin breathers, such as the worms, where they don't have any specialized organs and gases go straight across the body surface. Let's have a look at some of the other gas exchange systems across different species. So firstly, we've got the gill system, which we can see up here with the fish. And you can see that the respiratory surface here are these gill extensions that come off the body of the animal. And if you take a closer look, we'll have a better look at the gills shortly. There's little projections, again, maximizing surface area, which allow oxygen to diffuse in from water into the bloodstream of the animal and the CO2 to diffuse out. It's a bit more complex than that, and we'll have a look at that soon. Now, there's also a tracheal system, which is present in insects. And if we have a look at this cockroach down here, their systems, they're like your open system. So rather than having a internal circulatory system where you've got blood moving through veins and capillaries and arteries, the insect has a tracheal system, which is made of tubes that kind of connect to the external environment. If we have a look at this is basically its body, and then there's these openings here which are going to allow gases to pass in and out. And it's straightforward. Environmental gas comes in, moves throughout the body via these tubes, and then the gas products leave. Lastly, we've got lung systems. So that's our closed respiratory systems like mammals. And if we take a cross section of the animal, we have our lungs. And then in the very, very fine air sacs of the alveoli, again, we have a single-celled layer of cells which allow gases to diffuse straight across. So even though they're very different mechanisms, they have those shared properties that we mentioned: large surface area, very thin, and an efficient exchange of those two gases. You can have a look at this figure in your Pearson textbooks. Again, figure A here is showing you that tracheal system of the insects, and that the gap that separates the internal and external environments called the spiracle. And as air enters the spiracle, it's able to go down that tracheal system, and it's able to go and be stored in these air sacs and wherever that the animal needs the oxygen. This is interesting too, because this is why a lot of insects are very light and low density, because they're full of air. Okay, now here's our gills again, and if we have a better look at the image from Pearson on the right, water flows in one direction through the fish gills, and that's through the mouth. Now, if the fish is taking in water through the mouth, the water passes the gills, and as you can see from these arrows, it moves through the folds in the gills. If we take a closer look here, you can see water rushing through the gill structure. Now, as it's doing that and water passes over those folds, oxygen is able to diffuse into the blood vessels from that water, and CO2 as well is able to leave via that same process. There is a video here that you can have a look at that shows this in a little bit better detail. It's probably easier if you have a look at how this works. Okay, now in mammals, we have both the lymphatic and circulatory systems. Circulatory system, like I said before, is a closed system, and it has a double circuit for us as mammals. So that includes the pulmonary and the systemic circulation. So we'll get to that shortly. We have blood vessels, and that includes arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries are always shown as the red ones in diagrams, and they take blood from the heart to the rest of the body. Veins are shown as blue, and they carry blood from the body back to the heart. Capillaries are really, really fine vessels. So often we see these major vessels shown in the diagram here, but the capillaries are the finest ones that we might not even be able to see. And that's where the gas exchange is actually going to take place, in those small vessels. For us, we rely on our heart to act as a muscular pump for pumping this blood around the body. Now let's take a closer look at the capillaries. I mentioned that the alveoli were one cell thick, and it's the same with the capillaries, which is really useful because it allows efficient gas exchange. If we have a look at this out of Pearson, your figure 5.1.8, you can see a capillary here. Its walls are very thin, and within the capillary we've got one layer of red blood cells that are able to flow through that capillary in single file. So gas exchange is really efficient, and those capillaries will eventually lead into arteries and veins that are much bigger. If we have a look at this, here's a capillary. So this would be a layer of sort of skin type cells, tissue cell, that makes the capillary, and inside the capillary would be little red blood cells, compared to our arteries and veins, which are made up of multiple layers. So they've got the epithelial layer as well as a muscle layer and connective tissue and elastic layer. Like if you sort of poke your veins, they have a bit of a bounce back to them. And your arteries, again, muscle, epithelial, elastic, connective tissue. So much more complex than our simple capillaries. You wouldn't be able to have simple diffusion occur across arteries and veins. They're too thick, and that's not one of the features of an effective gas exchange surface. We're looking for thin and flat and easy to diffuse across, short diffusion distance. Now let's take a look. I've mentioned the alveoli, and here it is, the cauliflower-like structure. So for us, our respiratory system, as we can see over here, it begins with the nasal cavity or the mouth, where we take air in. And air is going to be able to come into, I'm going to change colors because everything on here is kind of red and blue. Okay, so air is going to come down the airway either via the nose or the mouth, and it's going to pass into our trachea, which is this part at the front of your neck here that you can feel. It's surrounded by cartilage, and that's so that it keeps our airway open because it's exposed to the external environment. And you can feel that cartilage, those rings of cartilage at the front of your neck there. Now, as the air travels down the trachea, it's going to split off into two different sides, and we call these the left and the right bronchus. Okay, the left and right bronchus, and the air is going to continue to travel down the bronchus into the smaller vessels called the bronchioles, and finally down to the finest of finest little air sacs, which are our alveoli. So if you have a look here, here's the bronchiole. So this is kind of this part here, and the last little bit, the alveoli, are there, and they really do look like little branches of coral or cauliflower or something like that. Now each one of those tiny little alveoli look like this microscopically. So maximizing surface area, and the important thing is they're really heavily surrounded by those capillaries. The alveoli itself is single-celled. The capillaries are single-celled. So that allows efficient gas exchange. Oxygen and CO2, as we can see here, oxygen is able to enter the alveoli, diffuse straight into the capillary. CO2 is able to diffuse from the capillaries back into the alveoli for us to exhale. Now, we'll talk more about the path that this goes in a little bit. Now, this is just going over what I've just mentioned about the different parts that the air is going to travel. So going from the nose and the throat into the pharynx at the back of the throat, down the trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles until we get to the terminal air sacs, which are the alveoli. And again, this is a really nice picture here that shows the alveoli, and we've got our oxygen-rich blood. So if we've just breathed in a nice big breath, that oxygen is going to diffuse into the capillaries. And notice it's red. So that oxygen-rich blood goes into the capillaries and into the arteries, because the arteries are carrying blood from the lungs, getting pumped from the heart to the rest of the body. The oxygen-poor blood, that's already been delivered to the body. The body's used the oxygen, and now it's going to have CO2 in it, and it needs to be gotten rid of. And that travels via the veins back to the lungs, so from the body back to the lungs to be exhaled. Lovely little image there of the alveoli, and this is showing you that red and blue, so the oxygen-rich versus oxygen-poor. It's just lovely. Look at those lovely little air sacs. Maximizing surface area. Perfect if we're talking about gas exchange surfaces. There is a video there for you to have a look at. Please do. Now, an important molecule that we're going to look at now is hemoglobin. And these are a very special protein that are found in our red blood cells. And their one and only job is to bind oxygen and allow the oxygen to be carried around the body. So think red blood cells are these beautiful discs, and inside them are packed with hemoglobin. And hemoglobin's job is to bind oxygen, and it's going to carry that oxygen around. If we have a look at starting over here, so when we take a big breath in, and oxygen from our lungs is going to reach the alveoli, diffuse across the alveoli into the capillaries. When I say into the capillaries, they're going to diffuse into those single layer of red blood cells that's inside those capillaries. And just like what everything else we've talked about, the red blood cells are very thin, flat, so that oxygen can diffuse in. Now, when the oxygen diffuses in, you can see here it's now inside the red blood cell. It's traveling via binding to the hemoglobin. And once the red blood cell reaches where it needs to go, so our organs, our working muscles, it's able to then offload that oxygen to the areas that require it. it can then bind carbon dioxide and make its journey back to the lungs to be removed. Now, in the syllabus, it mentioned how being able to predict the movement of gases. Now, obviously, if we've talked about factors that can affect diffusion and things like that, obviously, if we think about a blood vessel that's really low in oxygen, naturally that's going to mean that there's a larger concentration gradient for oxygen to enter. This one here is looking at the filtration of fluids across a capillary wall. And when we start looking at blood pressure and things like that, there's a balance of osmotic pressure happening within our capillaries. So if we sort of think about, let's look at the middle here where there's no net movement. So this is a capillary, very thin, one red blood cell thin. If the pressure inside our capillary is equal to the pressure outside of the capillary, that's where we have a steady, no net movement of anything across the capillary. When we talk about filtration of blood, this is where fluid is going to exit the capillary. So this is what happens on the arterial end. So that's the side that is oxygen rich. So we've breathed in, oxygen's diffused in, and the blood is full of oxygen ready to be carried around. Now, because of that, we have a greater pressure inside the capillary than what we have outside the capillary. So that encourages blood to filter out to other areas where they require oxygen. Conversely, on the other end, on the venous end, where we've got our veins, because we have our red blood cells, no oxygen, oxygen poor because the organs have used it, the pressure outside of the capillary is higher than inside, and that forces reabsorption of blood back into the vessel, and that allows those blood cells to travel back to be reoxygenated. Okay, so now that we've looked at gas exchange surfaces and gas actually diffusing into our capillaries, it's important that we have a look at how that's traveling around the entire body now. Now, remember that red indicates oxygen-rich blood. So it's just been replenished with oxygen by the lungs and it's traveling via the arteries. The blue indicates deoxygenated blood, or blood that has had oxygen delivered somewhere and it needs to be reoxygenated. So having a look at the image on the left, here we have our lungs. So this is our right lung and left lung. It's kind of drawn in reverse as though you're looking at another person. Now in both cases, let's take a look at the red path. So that means we've taken a deep breath in and we can see that this red blood here is going to head this way, and you can see the arrow here heading into the heart, and from your left lung it's heading this way also into the same part of the heart. So both sides of the lung are filtering that nice oxygen rich blood into the left atrium of the heart. So we call this region the left atrium. From there it moves through a little valve into your left ventricle, and then it's moving up and out this major artery of the body called the aorta. It's a massive thick artery, and it's pumping blood from your little old heart to the entire body. So it can head up this way to your head and forelimbs, so the arms, and it can also head down this way to provide blood to the legs and all of your abdominal organs. Okay, so it's the right side, sorry, the left of your heart here is often much thicker and meatier because it has to do some extreme pumping. So the muscle volume on that left side of the heart is a lot stronger. Now, once we've delivered that oxygen-rich blood to the areas of the body that need it, we're left with deoxygenated blood. And that needs to travel back to the heart to be delivered back to the lungs for reoxygenation. So having a look at the legs here now, that deoxygenated blood is going to travel through the veins, and it's eventually going to make its way back to the major vein that leads into the heart, which is the vena cava. and we have an anterior and a posterior vena cava, but they basically feed to the same place. So that blood makes its way into the heart, into the right atrium. It travels down into the right ventricle, and it's going to travel up and out to these pulmonary arteries that make their way back to the lungs. Whenever you hear pulmonary, it's talking about the lungs. From there, we take a deep breath in again, and the whole process repeats. We travel back down the red path. So it's always a nice balance between the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. And even though I don't need you to know all of these fancy names of the vessels and things of the heart, but it is interesting to have a look at. And on the image on the right, you can see those vessels again here. So again, you've got your left atrium here, oxygenated blood from your lungs, carrying that blood into the left atrium, into the left ventricle, up and out the aorta to the rest of the body. And then from the body, we're going to be bringing that deoxygenated blood back into the right ventricle, I missed your right atrium, right ventricle, and out the pulmonary artery back to your lungs for reoxygenation. Okay, so hopefully from this you're able to explain the relationship between the structure and function of gas exchange surfaces, such as alveoli and gills, in terms of exchange of gas. Hopefully you can explain how the structure and function of capillaries facilitates exchange of materials between the internal environment and cells. And hopefully you'll be able to use data to predict the direction of material movement between alveoli and capillaries in muscle tissue. So that's just predicting where oxygen would offload to in different scenarios. Now there's some tasks for you to do. Have a look at the OneNote. There's also some videos for you to watch, and please make sure you ask me questions.